is there, other than normative rationales, because it's not the tradition and it's not normative for us to do this kind of thing, right? To consecrate someone's loaf of bread across town. Can you make a theological argument against why that shouldn't be possible in these strange times? And that then digs down a bit deeper in it, and is to say, how do we understand God's presence in digital space, right? Are digital spaces even real, right? And do we understand God's sort of, the way God has become enfleshed in the world, right? We've blown that out. We'll talk about that God is in all things. How, are we willing to talk about God as just the best collection of ones and zeros in a digital screen ever?
The platonic form of zeros and ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
So weirdly, what came to mind for me was this old practice that I've seen some priests do, and some priests that I consider more devout and even maybe more liturgically bound than myself, placing a piece of consecrated bread into the wine by way of, and that in some ways used to be how the wine was considered consecrated, because the wine was kind of a secondary, both kinds were not considered equal at that time, right? And so the bread was considered a sort of elevated way of receiving, and the wine was sort of an undercut way.
Right.
But I don't know why my mind sort of went there, but that was another way of sort of binding the control of, like, a very shamanistic way of looking at how we, and one thing is that will, and I talk sometimes about how my priesthood is a reflection of old shamanism, right? Like, I sometimes conceptualize priesthood as, that there is something arcane about the priesthood, and there's not really any sort of, theological basis for that. I'm not a magician, right? Like, I don't think that my prayers are, that God listens to my prayers any differently than anybody else's.
Right.
But I think that prayer is a part of my life in a way that prayer is not a part of most people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
It's sort of like, I've got like one thought of, before I want to shift in a different direction on some of that notes, as you were saying that, and I was thinking about, like, it isn't the case that our priesthood, that our physical selves possess some extra measure of the divine which makes the Eucharist happen, right? I think that is an old model. That's that shaman model, right? That arcana kind of thing, right? Like in the D&D sense, right? Like, arcane magic. Like, I have this thing within me that other people don't, and therefore I can do it. What I do think is that our collective materiality, priests and people, all of our material selves in the gathering make the Eucharist possible, right? So then, since we're in this separation from being embodied together, right, breathing the same air, what I want to try to think about or get to is that we're not talking about virtual space, right? We're not talking about everybody putting on the Oculus Rift and going to a virtual church and seeing virtual bread and wine and our avatars eating the bread and wine and calling that communion, right? We're not talking about that.
No.
We're talking about this, just the sense of the way our persons are still interacting through telecommunication, but can't the spirit still work in that and through that, right? And so again, to go back to this, digital time is just a different form of being material with one another. That's how I'm beginning to see it as. Right?
Well, and for me, like any question of materiality involving the Eucharist has to inevitably involve a conversation about how you conceive of the priesthood in our tradition,
right.
Because you can't have Eucharist without a priest or a presbyter.
Right.
Right. And in fact, that it's been a practice in this diocese, and we're starting to see a change, that we're not seeing. It used to be that deacons could distribute Mass in the absence of a priest. They couldn't consecrate more bread, but they could, and we're sort of shifting away from that in our diocese, and so I think that a conversation about, because it wouldn't be a problem in a tradition where lay people could celebrate communion, right? Because then we would all just be, celebrating communion wherever we were, right? There's something about an appointed and empowered symbol of authority of the church, performing that ritual, and for now, sort of in the physical presence of, of a body of the faithful.
Right.
Because in our diocese now, what we're seeing are sort of, or what we were seeing before we went to sort of stricter guidelines about the Eucharist in the midst of COVID-19, was we were seeing sort of two different thoughts about the Eucharist come up at the same time. And one was the one that we're using now, which is people watch the priest celebrate communion, and then the priest partakes of communion on behalf of everyone else, right? And then the other model that we aren't doing anymore was ahead of time, people would distribute the reserved sacrament, which is already consecrated. And then when the priest got to the part of the service in the church where they partake of the bread and the wine, the people would partake of the reserved sacrament at the same time.